There is a quick disclaimer for avid Boy Afraid watchers that provides context to the reason the video is the way it is, and the philosophy of my channel going forward at the end of the video, so just letting you guys know. When concerning art of any form, homogeneity is simply a fact of life.
It's called Art for Art's Sake, subtitled Money for God's Sake.
After an industry has evolved to a certain point, there will be an unwritten formula created on how to make a successful game. Not necessarily a good game, not necessarily a creative game or memorable, but one that will sell and, typically speaking, appeal to a broad group of people. In the year 2020, it's become such a prevalent thing that a game with the Avengers license is somehow boring.
Is Marvel's Avengers a piece of 16th century neckwear because it's rough?
And comparable to many other games. However, in the same year where we have that Avengers game, we also have, made by one person and a few collaborators I think post-release, one of the most ambitious, unique games I've ever played. I'm talking about World of Horror. World of Horror was a game I found on Xbox Game Pass. It did not for 1 second occur to me that it was possible that down the line, this would be one of my favorite games of all time. So strap in, because I'm As a lot of you may know, graphical fidelity is not always the quickest path towards good presentation. Of course it can help, but good presentation is almost always earned exclusively through strong, creative, and artistic vision. For example, here's the title screen to Marvel's Avengers, a game with an astounding budget, and yet, as evident right here, a distinct lack of soul or personality. For comparison, here's Persona 5, a game with a far smaller budget and a far nicher demographic. Now, while Persona may have issues regarding its budget, it has never struggled to now or in the past find an identity, and each game has its own unique look that can be appreciated even by people who aren't fans of the series. Looking at them side by side, it's almost no contest. This game certainly embodies that idea. Being made by one guy in MS Paint, it's actually really impressive what World of Horror managed to accomplish visually.
In a river the color of lead, immerse the baby's head.
The first thing you'll notice is that the game allows you to display itself in 1 or 2 bits, along with a wide range of color palettes. Of course, this game being a love letter to older computer games, naturally this is a feature that's very much welcome.
The MS-DOS 5 upgrade is a hit, and no PC should be without it.
No PC should be without it.
And certainly helps with the aesthetic they're going for. Along with the 80s setting that the game takes place in, these two work together in tandem to deliver something that is really cool and alternative. Of course, the 80s setting is not so brash or bold anymore as a lot of modern pieces of media tend to like the 80s as their setting nowadays. My love for this aesthetic has waned rather significantly over the years, and this is because it's used in a very disingenuous way a lot of the time. For example, Stranger Things, and they aren't the only one guilty of this, but in Stranger Things, the 80s aesthetic amounts to basically little more than consumerist nostalgia, saying, hey, remember the Ghostbusters?
Everything all right, Snake?
I was having that dream again.
Yeah, I do. Everybody on this planet does. And it's a very, very dishonest way of trying to shark a few positive responses where they aren't merited. Now, while World of Horror will undoubtedly tickle your nostalgia bone, it does so in a much, much furtive and respectful way than what I mentioned previously. Sure, there are things like cars or other pieces of technology within the world of Horror that are reminiscent of that era. A lot of the fashion sense that the characters have is definitely an allusion to the 80s, but for the most part, the inspiration it takes from the 80s tends to come down to the game's aesthetic and motif, and its want to mimic that era of video games. And I find that a lot more cathartic than just showing me, I don't know, Pogs or something, right? Because that's something that you had to be in the know to really appreciate. Or even if you weren't really in the know, it's still something you can look at and go, wow, this game has such a unique look, it has such a personality it's carved out for itself. Of course, I would be remiss to mention the more dominant and arguably more important component of its setting and presentation and overall aesthetic, which would be the horror element. Horror is a pretty hard thing to design for. It's not as popular as the other big genres of film, and because of that, people who consume horror on the regular tend to really scrutinize the media they consume.
Gonna reboot Child's Play. Most people be like, didn't you want that? Yeah, with the original people. No, they're not coming back. Because the original people, Don Mancini also, they're gonna do the TV series. Which is, to me, bullcrap. You don't know nothing about Chucky, so shut the fuck.
Same goes for video games, which may have experienced a bigger drought of good horror games than the movie industry. One of the biggest hurdles that I see in a lot of video games when concerning horror is they tend to go for cliches or something that, at least from a deducible standpoint, would come off as the scariest possible thing.
What a fucking nick.
And because of that, a lot of horror video game enemies tend to look, unfortunately, samey. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that a lot of the same inspirations are regurgitated. This is just what happens with all types of movies. Eventually, the thing that works becomes a more prevalent idea. But that's not ever something World of Horror seems to have to worry about. World of Horror's creator has obviously, at least according to all the character designs, consumed a lot of horror media, whether it be read, watched, etc. You can see things going all the way from being inspired by Lovecraft to more conventional, street-level, common horror genres like slashers. It's always fun running into an enemy in World of Horror, looking up what their name means, or potentially what they've been inspired by, and finding out it's a very, very creative reinterpretation of some Japanese folktale. But the bigger and arguably more important inspiration that World of Horror presents us with is its love of Junji Ito.
こんにちは、ホラー漫画家の伊藤潤二です。
A lot of signature things that Junji Ito adopts in his work can be seen inside of the character designs of World of Horror. Take, for example, the two pictures I'm about to put on screen right now. The one on the left is from Junji Ito, and the one on the right is from World of Horror. Now, technically, these two are both just simply regular human beings in their respective worlds. But they're both designed in a way that's just jarring enough to elicit some sort of response, that in your brain would go, yes, if I saw that person in real life, I would be at unease. And that is really beautiful. That's something very subtle that not everybody can realistically achieve or understand. World of Horror's amazing visuals are amazing in their own right, but the way World of Horror really engrosses you in the world is using two additional methods. The first one, and arguably more important one, is World of Horror's writing. World of Horror will provide literary context to every event in the game, whether it be a situation you come across in the world or an enemy encounter. This writing we will discuss later on has a gameplay function as well, but for now we're just going to be talking about its function in presentation. To elaborate on my point, let me read you an example, the text that shows up prior to fighting the Koi woman. You spot a woman on the beach and decide to get closer and ask what she is doing here alone, and so late. When the woman turns around, you stop. Her mouth is opening and shutting, gulping in the air as if it was unnatural to her. And then of course you're shown the visual representation of the Koi woman along with the background of the location where you found her. So the writing's done in a very specific way where it's a play-by-play of your character's thoughts. So what you're able to do is, in your head, put together how this situation exactly looks and comes about. Furthermore, the text is written in a similar way, I don't know if it's intentional or not, to the classic Junji Ito page turn, in which Junji Ito will provide context, albeit vague context that is missing information, to what is going to occur on the next page of his manga, only for you to turn the page and find something that's supposed to blow your expectations out of the water. In this case, you get this vague description of somebody who for whatever reason is unable to breathe air, and then it turns out the reason they can't breathe air is because they're a literal fish hybrid person. Now, the structure of the text that I read previously is a very common rule held throughout the game. Most enemy encounters or event encounters are read to you in that way, your character's thoughts being relayed to you in a first person. However, it is not an absolute rule, and the game will break it occasionally if the result can be more impactful. And for this, I'm going to be citing an example that's a pretty big mystery within the game. The fandom's quite a big fan of it, so if you want to experience it for yourself, go ahead. It's not the worst thing in the world if you hear it from my mouth, but still, I'd like to give people that option to skip ahead if they'd like.
Hello.
Now, of course, I'm talking about something truly evil. I'm not going to be divulging in how you fight this enemy, but it's done through a very, very odd way, and the character seems to break a lot of conventions the game seeks to teach you. What I'd instead like to do is take a look at the text that shows up prior to this enemy's encounter. You see how there's regular descriptions of your surroundings, and then there's this all caps bracketed text, accompanied by no soundtrack. It's like the most video gamey way of trying to convey eeriness I've ever seen, and it is incredibly reminiscent of older methods of producing horror games, and that is absolutely what I love about this game, is it understands that culture so much, and you simply won't find this type of dedication to that aesthetic or that genre of video games anywhere else.
So, you like Azure Dreams?
A lot of snake. Oh, a lot of your heart at the old snake. A lot of snake. Oh, a lot of your. A lot of snake. Oh, a lot of your. Oh, a lot of your heart at the old.
Hello, welcome back.
Did you like it?
It took way longer than I thought, but hey, that's the process, right? So I'm going to be talking about the motion portion of the topic that I brought up earlier. Now, when I say motion is used in the game, I am sort of talking about World of Horror's unique approach to divulging details in a visual way. Now, for example, let's take Pokemon. Most Pokemon games were released on a handheld. Now, handhelds are not nearly as strong as, you know, consoles. Even to this day, despite how many leaps they've made, they're still lagging behind, which is natural, right? Because of that, Pokemon has never really had that raw graphical fidelity that a lot of other AAA games have. So when it tries to convey very abstract concepts, it has to do so in very minimalistic ways, and it has to do so through implying. Something that comes to mind as an example would be Old Chateau from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. A spooky mansion in the woods bereft of any human beings. Well, most of the time. Sometimes when you go in certain rooms, the room adjacent to yours might show that somebody's in there. Of course, naturally, you're gonna leave the room and go right in, you want to talk to them. Only to find out they were never there. This, in a very, very simplistic way, creates a spooky atmosphere. It's quite dark for the Pokemon series, if we're being honest with ourselves. World of Horror, in a somewhat similar manner, will do furtive things in order to characterize things around it, particularly its enemies. Let's take the Bloated Teacher, for example. When you fight the Bloated Teacher, he appears as this husky, lethargic fellow. He breathes. His eyes squint while he's breathing, right? So you'd picture him to kind of move more or less like just a fat dude.
Well, I don't know who the hell you're talking about, because I'm certainly not getting my hand held. I'm not fat.
Now compare this with the Time Warper, another humanoid entity. Now the Time Warper, unlike the Bloated Teacher, is very, very still. He has his head almost affixed looking at the ground. I mean, not that he really has anything resembling eyes, but if he did, he wouldn't be looking at anything special. And he has this almost grin on, this inhuman, not quite a smile you'd see anybody put on. But it's the fact that his absence of movement makes him disturbing in such a different way from the Bloated Teacher. You would not say that they would move similarly. You wouldn't say that Time Warper even moves like a regular human being. Regular human beings are never that still. So you see, in this scenario, literally removing 2 frames of animation has now characterized this enemy. And this is just one of several very unique examples of animation used to characterize enemies in the game. But furthermore, there is sparse amounts of motion when it comes to transitions, or sometimes the backgrounds of fights feature CRT lines, or the background itself has this very wavy, dreamish, or nightmarish, depending on how you interpret it, motion going on with it, which of course plays into that 80s aesthetic earlier. But this game's use of motion, at the end of the day, is very, very small. It is a mostly still, non-moving game. But it's the fact that the few times it uses motion can be very, very impactful, and there's a lot to appreciate in that. Hello. What you essentially watched was a failed project of mine. Originally, it was supposed to be a comprehensive analysis of the entire game as a whole, but when it came to stuff past the visuals, like the soundtrack and analysis of the gameplay, for example, things fell flat. I recorded tons and tons and tons, but when it came down to it, I couldn't piece it together in a way that I thought was enjoyable or I'd be proud of it. So I'm going to upload this as is for people who do watch my channel and want content. And the philosophy going forward is going to be more condensed, microcosmic content. And the reason is because I tend to find myself losing interest in a project the longer it goes on. And when things become a bore for me, I tend to do some really poor work. So essentially, you know, look forward to more videos that are in the same length as the Todd Alquist video or the Among Us video. Just short, very well edited videos that essentially, you know, will be interesting. Stuff that maybe isn't on YouTube yet. Stuff that people haven't really talked about. So that's essentially the philosophy going forward. Thank you to everybody who subscribed to me because of the last video. I hope that you're looking for this type of content. I'm not going to upload any more Among Us videos, but thank you for being on board, and have a good one.